I have really lived here by walking the city, feeling the movements, the sun, which is very particular in Mexico City, the quality of light that we have here, the smells and noises, the trees, the birds, the people, all of that, those impressions are in me because it's part of my life, and it has been for all of my for 30 years, So I've come to realize that the city is part of me. So my music, in many ways, is a reflection of what I've become as a citizen of this city.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, folks, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If it's your first time listening, it's so great to have you along. My name is Tyler, and I'm a composer, a broadcaster, curator, producer. The list goes on, and it keeps growing. Feels like every single day. But it all comes down to the fact that I just love to make things. And on this show, I sit down with other creative folks to talk about their process, philosophy, and everything that shapes who they are as artists and why they also like to make what they make. And if you have been listening for a while, welcome back. I always appreciate you joining me. On this episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by composer Charly Daniels. Charly is a Mexican composer based in Mexico City, where his work spans orchestral and chamber music, film, dance, and symphonic bands. His music has been performed widely in Mexico and internationally, and in 2020, his orchestral career took a major leap after winning first prize at the Future Symphony Competition in Lithuania, which helped open doors for frequent performances of his orchestral music at home in Mexico. Charly and I first met in person earlier this year at the Penn State New Music Festival, and we immediately hit it off. I knew right away that I wanted to sit down with him and have him on the show. And so in this conversation, Charly reflects on his unusual journey into composing, from sequencing music as a teenager with no formal theory background to eventually discovering orchestral music as his creative home. We also talk about how Mexico City's culture and energy filter into his music, his shift from highly rhythmic writing to more contemplative sound worlds, and how his experience with synesthesia directly shapes his approach to harmony, timbre, and form. It was so much fun sitting down with Charly, and I just can't wait to share this conversation with you. We'll begin in just a moment. This show grows because of people like you, not some algorithm. So if something in today's conversation sparks something for you, the best way to support it is to follow the podcast and to share it with someone who'd get it too. You'll find links to subscribe, follow us on Instagram, or support on Patreon, all in the show notes or at looseleaftransmissions.com. Now, on to my conversation with Charly Daniels. Well, Charly, we only just met recently in Pennsylvania at the Penn State New Music Festival, and we pretty much hit it off right away, I felt like, but we didn't get to talk for too long while we were there.
Yeah, it was a kind of like a quick conversation, but it was a good one, I think.
Yeah, quick introduction, but I just really loved your energy, and it was so clear to me like I had to have you on the podcast. And I also encountered your music, of course, at the festival, but I first encountered your music like years ago through I think the Borderlands Ensemble, and I absolutely love what you do. So I'm just really looking forward to this, and I appreciate you joining me today.
Well, I'm very, very happy to be here, Tyler. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So where we like to start here on the Music Maker podcast is as far back as you remember or as far back as you're willing to share on kind of your creative journey. So I'd like to ask you, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer?
That's an interesting question because as a composer can mean, I tend to think that a composer is like an artist in general. So I have a lot of artistic memories from my early childhood that not necessarily relate to music so directly, but I feel like they're quite important because, like, if you remember something aesthetic from like when you were 4, that's bound to have an impact on your life as an adult artist. And I was just a few days ago, I don't know why I remembered a play that I saw when I was a little kid, and I think I was like 5 or 4 years old, but it really stuck with me several of the images because it was very fascinating. I don't even remember the story, but there was a female character that had to drink from like a little clay cup she had, which symbolized her soul. And there were these giant puppets controlled by several people, like dressed in black, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember that play very vividly, despite I don't remember anything about the story. But I think what really got to me, even in those days, was that it was very powerful emotionally. So thankfully nowadays we have AI to help us with a search on the internet. So I actually found out the name of the play, which I'm very happy because I'll try to find it, and if I can, I'll see it again. It's called El Pozo de los Mil Demonios, which means the well of the thousand demons. So that it's funny because it's not really a composition or a music related experience, but it was very, very powerful. And it's one of my earliest artistic memories.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, because I mean, so much of what we encounter, especially as children, as young people, and even as like young adults. I mean, I remember going to like art museums and seeing like, you know, paintings with like these textures on them that I'd never thought about before. And I was, at this point I was like, I was composing, but I was like a young person composing, right? I was like a baby composer. And just seeing the textures on the canvas got me thinking about music in so many different ways. So it totally makes sense that, this play would have like an artistic impression on you that would later perhaps manifest in your music compositional work, which I'm sure we'll get into soon.
I no, I agree 100%. And now that you mentioned that, I have another very important memory from my early childhood because my parents were like very prone to taking me and my brother to art exhibits and things like that. And for some reason, it got into their mind that they wanted to take us to an exhibition of abstract expressionism.
Oh yeah,
And it was like several rooms full of these very completely abstract paintings where basically the message was communicated through color, form, texture. So it was very abstract, very vivid. And I remember looking at it, and I was very impressed by all the visual information I was receiving. But I also felt like this is my language. I felt like I could. I mean, I'm not a painter or anything, but if I were, I might be an abstract expressionist.
yeah, I gotcha. So these are like early kind of artistic impressions that you're getting from other kind of disciplines. Can you tell me about the moment that you, whether intentionally or unintentionally, like put notes on a page as a composer? Like, what was that like?
Well, that started happening a little later on. I mean, I guess I was in my late childhood, early teens. My dad is a musician also. He plays guitar. So he had me and my brother playing with him, jamming a lot. And at some point, our childhood was basically witnessing how my dad would play in bands
Mm,
sometimes. And sometimes he would split up from a band, and sometimes he would start a new project, like that happens with artists. And at some point, he broke up with one of his bands, and he decided he wanted to go solo, and he bought a keyboard which had a sequencer.
Oh, yeah.
And that was pretty awesome because he could do his music on his own. He didn't need a band. And then he taught us how to use the sequencer. And at the time, I used to be a drummer. I played drums, you know? I have a big relationship with percussion instruments, and the drums were my first instrument. But the second instrument was that keyboard. And at first, what I would do is like record some basic, make up some basic tracks so I could play along with the drums. And it was an interesting process because I started spending every time more of my musical activity time on the sequencer and less on the drums
Mm,
until it happened at some point that I went into the studio. We had a little studio in the house, and I just went straight to the keyboard and made like a complete song, and I didn't even touch the drums that day. So I spent probably most of my teenage years just sitting on that keyboard making little pieces of music. And those like 6 years of my life. Yeah, and by the way, I didn't know anything about music theory, music notation, aside from the very basic stuff they would teach us at school. But I barely knew anything about the treble clef and some basic rhythmic notation. But I didn't use those tools at all. It was just like spending time on the sequencer, hitting record, trying to play a tune with a specific sound that I chose, and then just making music from there. And that's really how I it's funny because it's really how I learned to make music more than probably more than when I actually decided to become a composer and study formal music. I mean, I do see those years as very fundamental in my formative years.
I mean, I think as composers, maybe there's like one of maybe two or three, just a handful of entry points into how we become composers. And
Yeah.
I think what you're describing, it really aligns with my own kind of beginning as a composer. It's all based on like aural. It's all like, what do you hear? It's like your intuition. And I remember kind of just playing at a keyboard and recording it into like a computer or something, and that's it. I wasn't putting notes on a page or anything like that. And I know composers who maybe they did start from a theory background. It's like they're playing in some ensemble and they're like, oh, I want to make music and I know music theory, let's put it together. So
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, but I think what you're describing is so valuable, and it's so interesting, and I'm curious to know, like, when you did finally, like, you're talking about it like when I was doing this stuff and then I became a composer, but like you're already kind of a composer, but I know what you mean. Like, so like when you started putting notes on a page, how did it all fit together at that point?
Yeah, well, the thing is that my dad was uh, kind of like our music guru because, as I said, my parents didn't really weren't very interested in like taking us to learn an instrument with a teacher or anything like that. They had this idea that art should be more like playful and more intuitive. And as I said, my dad plays guitar. My mom, she plays piano. She's a mathematician, but she plays piano. She used to play piano at home, so the piano was always there. We would always it was open. Like there weren't these like special rules, which I've now found out that some families have,
Yeah,
that that's a piano and you can't touch it because it's important.
right.
And then what's your relationship with the instrument? But in our case, the piano was always there, so we could just walk by and hit some keys, you know, and it was a closeness happening there. So music was really a bunch of things, but an important part of our teenage years was because my dad, he used to drive us to school, and in those days we would listen to music in the car because there were no cell phones around, so we didn't really get distracted with anything. So your choices were like look out the window or look at the window and listen to music. And we always loved the music. Like he would play like progressive rock. A lot of the times we would listen to Led Zeppelin, we would listen to King Crimson, Pink Floyd, that sort of stuff. And someday he just decided to put on some classical music, right? And it was Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, the New World
Ah,
Symphony.
yeah.
And my brother and I hated it because we were like, oh no, here comes my dad with his boring classical music, you know? But, and then we thought it was just going to be one day, but the next day was the same. And we were like, he like broke our defenses. So like we didn't care anymore. And then the next step it was that we actually started listening to it. And I remember very vividly listening to the slow movement. There's like an oboe melody, and I remember having an emotion reacting to the oboe. And that was the moment where I felt like, okay, this is music. This is actual real music. It's not that boring stuff I used to think. So we started to listening to a lot of classical music in the car, and we listened to Beethoven, we listened to Tchaikovsky, we listened also to 20th century composers, like we listened to the Rite of Spring, we listened to Shostakovich. He actually had a tape, because that was a tape system they had in the car, with some Penderecki stuff. But by the time we were listening to Penderecki, I was like already in tune with the classical music stuff. So I was listening, and I was thinking things like, oh, this music is really cool, but it needs more rhythm, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
Imagine
yeah.
that. But that's like yeah, so that was like our introduction to classical music. And then we started going to classical music concerts, like, because there are several orchestras here in Mexico City, and the one we used to go to was the OFUNAM, which is a Philharmonic of the UNAM, which is the main university here in Mexico. And those were very great experiences. So at some point, I had this idea that classical music was music from the past, and like the music from the present was like rock music and other type of, like, other instruments, other harmonies, and so on. And at some point, they did a world premiere by a Mexican composer, and the composer was right there in the concert hall. So I thought the piece was brilliant, was very amazing. And actually, the composer came down and took a bow. And at that moment, it clicked, like, oh my God, this is a possibility. This is a career possibility. And that was the time I made the decision, like, I'm going to be a composer. Like, the moment I realized it was possible, I knew that that's what was going to be my pursuit in life. And I've never regretted that decision.
How old were you at that moment?
Let me see. I guess I was like 17,
Okay, yeah.
17
So
years
so like
old.
just before maybe college,
Yeah,
and
just
like
before college.
when you had to make that
Be-
decision anyway.
the decision, exactly. So the
Yeah.
decision was kind of there. That's probably why I was also thinking about the possibilities. So when I saw that possibility, I thought, okay, that's my choice. So from that moment on, I couldn't wait. So I started downloading notation software and started doing my first little experiments. And I actually got a cracked version of Finale in those days. And I just started making some little pieces. I didn't know anything about instruments, but I had a huge experience, like intuitive experience with timbres, and I'd been to a lot of orchestra concerts. So it wasn't foreign to me in any way. I mean, I was just like trying to do what I knew I had decided I wanted to do in my life.
So you were at this concert, you saw a composer, a living
I saw
composer
a
for the
composer, a
first
living
time.
composer.
But
Mhm.
when was the first time that you encountered a composer face to face, like that you got to talk to a composer?
Yeah, that's interesting because I saw this guy many years later, and I actually met him on social media, and I've had conversations with him, and I've told him this story. But the first time I talked to a composer um, was again one of those concerts at the Ofunamdis Orchestra, and they played a concerto for percussion by a woman composer called Marcela Rodriguez. And it turns out that she was a kind of like a distant acquaintance of my parents.
Oh,
So
wow.
went and said hi, you know, and my mom said, Charlie's going to be a composer. And she said, I think she said something like, oh, poor Charlie, something like that,
Yeah,
something to
yeah,
that
yeah.
effect.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, really? Is it difficult? Is it complicated? But that didn't sway my intentions, but it did worry me just a little bit.
Yeah, that's, well, you had the opportunity you met Baljinder Sekhan, who was my
Yeah.
composition teacher, for my master's and also the first guest I had on this podcast, and that's, like, exactly something he would say. It's like, "Oh, you're gonna be a composer? I'm sorry to hear." As a joke, you know? So
Yeah.
maybe she was joking, but,
Oh, she was obviously joking. Yeah,
yeah,
completely a joke. But jokes have a basis on reality. So,
of
and
course.
and in a way, I guess what it means is that life as an artist is hard. It can be unpredictable, but that's life. I mean, I don't suppose life as an engineer is easy. I mean, different career paths lead to different types of difficulty, but difficulty is there, I think.
Mm, yeah. So,
Mhm.
can you share a bit of an overview, connect the dots, so to speak, of your creative journey from this point? So you make the decision, I'm going to be a composer, and then I imagine you probably went to university for that, maybe, or you started studies of some kind. Do you feel like you followed a more conventional path as a composer, from that point until today, or do you feel like there were, maybe unexpected twists and turns along the way that took you off of that kind of conventional path?
Well, I think there are conventional and non-conventional aspects to my career. When I was studying at the university, I had this idea of becoming a composer and just like creating scores and having musicians play the music. And that's what they prepared us for at school, and that's what I started doing. And my first experiences were like, it's actually funny because the first things we did was to like hire ensembles, like working ensembles as a collective of student composition students, and we produced a couple of concerts, and those went quite well, I think. And then there was a huge opportunity by the Mexico City Philharmonic, which was a different orchestra. It was just like a call for scores for a reading session,
Mm, yeah.
So if you were a student and you had an orchestral score, you could submit it, and if you were selected, the piece would actually be read. And funnily enough, I had been writing an orchestral piece on my free time, uh, apart from school, and it actually got selected, and that was my introduction to hearing my music being played by an orchestra. And I was like very young. I guess I was about 21 years old or something, and it was an amazing experience. And from the pieces that were read that day, there was a panel of jurors, and they selected a few pieces to actually be presented in the season by the orchestra. So I remember very well because my piece was like 8 to 10 minutes long, more or less. And then they played Mahler's Second Symphony. So, I mean, I had the feeling like if you played in a band and you opened for Metallica, something like that,
Right, right,
you
right.
know?
Yeah.
And, but I was 21. I didn't know anything about the world. So I just assumed, like, oh, this is going to be my life from now on. How wrong I was. How wrong I was, because the next orchestral experience I had came several years later. But I basically, that was the first part of my career, was like trying to get my music being played by ensembles and orchestras with varying degrees of success. The orchestra thing had to wait a little. I then attempted to apply to a master's degree at the conservatorium in Amsterdam, and unfortunately I wasn't selected. I didn't make it, the cut. So that put me in a situation where I had a bit of a crisis,
Yeah.
because I was accustomed to being a, quite a good student, I thought, and I felt like my music made sense and so on. So that was a big kind of like a little blow to my ego, and that made me think about many things. So I had a moment where I realized I have to change something. My music isn't like all it could be. I want to make it more unique, more of what I am capable of doing. So I decided to form my own ensemble where I wouldn't only be composing music but also performing my music on the percussion instruments I've been playing. Because, yeah, I didn't mention this, but after the drums, in my teenage years, I was also very much into hand percussion. So I had a bunch of like conga drums and a djembe and a bunch of stuff. So that was part of me, and I said it's time to integrate this into my music making. So I like called up some of my musician friends, and some replied, and we started a band. Basically, we started a band, and we called it chamber rock because we had this idea of making like chamber music, but we had the vibe of a rock band. That was our concept. And that project lasted for about 10 years, more or less. And at the same time, I was doing other things, continued writing for ensembles, mainly chamber music. And at the same time, I was working as a teacher, because, you have to work. And eventually, the ensemble, we worked quite a bit, mostly here in Mexico City. And how things happen, the band ceased to exist. We did manage to create an album, and it's on Spotify. But then, you know, came the pandemic, and suddenly I was without a band and with a lot of free time extra because I didn't have to commute. So I was spending all my time at home, like all of us, and I found a composition competition in Lithuania. It was called Future Symphony. And I decided to write a piece for this competition. And interestingly, because at this point I was very used to applying to composition competitions or these calls for scores, and the most common response one gets is like, unfortunately, you weren't selected, or something to that effect. But I kept trying, and this time the email began with the word congratulations. So it was a good email. And so basically, that meant that my piece, it was a piece for a chamber orchestra, and it was selected. I mean, among the 5 finalists, it was selected. It was going to be premiered in Lithuania, and eventually I won that competition. And that was like a huge thing for me because I actually managed to go to Lithuania, and imagine going to another continent during the pandemic,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
like
It's not easy.
passports. No, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. I remember being at the airport and having to come back home because there was some document I didn't have. I don't remember the details. I think I've forgotten them on purpose because of the trauma, you know. But I eventually I was on the plane. I went to Lithuania. I met these really cool composers, all the Lithuanian musicians, which were amazing, all very young, all very smart, all very intelligent. And my piece won the competition, and with that under my belt, you could say, that really opened the doors for me here in Mexico with all the orchestras. So I already made some contacts here in Mexico, but I try to get in touch with these people, and little by little I've started to get a lot of attention from the orchestras, to the point where, like, my music right now is being performed uh, quite often by the Mexico City Philharmonic, by the National Symphony Orchestra, by several orchestras in and around Mexico. So at the moment, the orchestral thing is going pretty well. But there was this time where, between when I was 21 years old and when I was 35, where the orchestral thing really hadn't much traction. So, I'm very happy because when I decided to be a composer, I I suppose I never made a rational decision about it, but now that I know that music has niches and so on, I really wanted to be an orchestral composer from the get go. So I'm very happy that that's finally happening for me.
Well, yeah, I was looking at your website and like you have a whole page of like orchestral compositions and it's
Yeah,
it's
I
it's
mean,
like
some of
so
them are not.
many.
Yeah, I have about almost 20 orchestral
Yeah, it's
compositions.
incredible.
The first half are not so good. The other half I'm very proud of.
Yeah. I'd love to dig into your ensemble writing. I mean, that's such a big part of what you do. Obviously, I'd love to dig into
Mhm.
that in just a little bit. But you're the first Mexico-based composer that I've had on the podcast. And when we first met, you were telling me all these great things about Mexico City. I mean, I was like wanting to go to Mexico City before, but then like I talked to you and I'm like, okay, now I have to go to Mexico
Oh,
City.
you definitely,
And
you have to come. You have to come.
and you know, I realized as soon as I asked my last question about like a conventional path versus unconventional path, well, you're in a different country than me, so that might mean something different. And I think probably it does.
Yeah, I think it does. One of the main differences, I don't really know because I'm in a different country, but from listening to your podcast, I did notice that graduated composition students, they try to become professional like very quickly, and in terms of, like, this is this might be sound a little ridiculous, but like charging money for their compositions, right?
Yeah,
So in Mexico, it's a little bit harder than that because, first of all, there isn't so much money. Like, to have a bunch of ensembles commissioning new composers for new music, that does happen, but it's not like very common at all. So most of the money for art comes from in the form of government grants. So some ensembles manage to get a grant, and then they might play some music by young composers. But for us as young composers, when I was a younger composer, it was more about like just getting the music played and having like a presence in the scene, you know. And really the expectation of money came later, like several years later. And so you have to be very creative in terms of how you want to move forward with your career. I mean, so yeah, it's basically to develop a presence in the music scene, try to get your music played. And there's also a music festival very important here in Mexico City called the Foro de Música Nueva, the Forum of New Music. It's a series of concerts held mostly in Mexico City, that they play new music and you want to get your music there. But there's no money for the composers. There's money for the ensembles. But like as far as things like commissions, for example, the first and only commissions I've ever had have come not from Mexican ensembles, but from American ensembles.
Interesting.
Like
Yeah.
they have the, and I'm very grateful because I've been approached and they say we want to commission a piece from you and say, well, that will be about this, you know, this amount, and they say, cool, that's great, let's do it, and a piece comes out of that. And yeah, I'm very happy to have those experiences. But as I said, a lot of the money comes from government grants, so you have to get into the system, you know.
Yeah, the topic of money is interesting, and I've had guests from Europe and whatnot on the show here, and we always kind of get into like comparing our
Yeah,
situations
comparing.
because
Yeah,
because as you've rightly pointed out, it's kind of like ingrained in us Americans from not even from like an early age as a composer, but just in our lives as humans, as as citizens. It's like money is like the most important thing. Like it's like you have to make decisions based off of financial security, which of course is like that's important, but I'm going to be 34 this year, later this summer. And I'm just now coming back around to this idea of maybe I should write music just for the hell of it. Maybe I should like not have to be commissioned. I shouldn't have to be commissioned to write the music that I want to make. Certainly, it would be great to have financial support, and certainly, people are still approaching me about commissions and offering me money and whatnot. But I think I've become increasingly aware over the past decade that it is important for me personally to be able to just make music for the sake of it, and
I agree.
hopefully someone will play it. Usually, like any piece I do plan to write, for free, I have someone in mind anyway that I'll send it to. But even that gets into questions about. I know so many American composers who talk about like being on the same page with commissioning fees because if so and so charges nothing, that makes it harder for so and so to charge like a real fee. And it's like this kind of equity issue which is worth talking about, but it gets very complicated very quickly.
It's very complicated because the idea of not charging for your work is obviously to getting out there in and being seen and making a reputation. But you don't really want to make your reputation as the person who doesn't charge for their work, right? So it's important but not easy to take that next step. In my case, I've always been like that. I mean, I've always had a fun music making that is just for me. It used to be more because now I have less free time, but like a lot of the time, even when I was a music student, I had my own composition projects that I did for myself that weren't like an assignment for a composition class.
Sure.
Like we had a composition teacher, and he said, "We're going to be working on a piece for a string quartet, and let's see what you've got." But at the same time, I was like, "Yeah, but in my free time, I can also write my own music based on what I want to do, right?" And that's always what I used to do. And now I have some additional projects, like I do some electronic music stuff, and it's completely just as a game.
Yeah.
It's I wouldn't call it serious music, but what does serious music mean? I mean, it's serious in the way that in the from the perspective that it's music that I make honestly for good reasons, which is to have fun and do it for the love of music.
Tyler here, and if you're enjoying this episode of Music Maker, well, just know that I've got a short form show called Micro Maker. Think of it as a distilled version of these conversations focused on powerful insights that you can listen to anytime. New episodes twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. Give it a follow. So I want to get back to Mexico City because I feel like there's a lot we can talk about regarding this place that you live. And I mean, you make it sound like Mexico City is like very new music friendly. There's this festival, there's the orchestras. Can you describe the general creative scene? I mean, it doesn't just have to be music in Mexico City, and how does that influence or impact your own work?
Yeah, well, Mexico City is, I would say, it's very art friendly in general. I mean, there are many artists. The thing is that most of the artists I know are musicians, but I know some other artists, and they have good things going for them as well. There's a huge film scene. We have many people who actually make movies, and it's good to be friends with them because they might give you work.
Right?
As a musician, but like considering music, there's this like huge spectrum of different musical styles that can be approached, and that means different niches, different audiences, different performers. Like you have from the very popular genres, like for music for dancing, music like very mainstream music, you can say. But like going for the more artistic side of things, you have a bunch of stuff also. Like you have experimental music, you have a lot of jazz musicians playing in different clubs. There's some places that have free jazz musicians that like do things with their instruments, like playing them in weird ways with a visual thing, performance, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of opportunity for artists to like find creative outlets. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of money, but there's a lot of art.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm guessing that for this to I mean, not necessarily this stuff can exist in a vacuum, but I'm guessing that like there's just regular people who are coming out and experiencing this, right? Like people like
Yeah,
it.
people like it. People like it. Like people
Yeah.
go there, they're very interested because a lot of these events, they have like, you can like also buy a drink, and it's kind of like a party sometimes. So you can have a mezcal. You know what mezcal is?
Oh yeah. Oh, I know.
Yeah, yeah. You can have a mezcal.
I'm a
You can
fan.
have a beer. Yeah, it's me too. It's a good thing. It's one of the good Mexican things, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's like a relaxed atmosphere, and then you go see this weird performance, and then you can continue chatting with your friends and so on. So that sort of thing happens. Regarding the new music scene, there's a variety of things because there are many composers in Mexico City, like many composers of all ages. Like you have the veterans like in their 70s to the young guys in their 20s, and it's a whole range. And also, this didn't used to be true maybe a decade ago or 15 years ago, but nowadays orchestras are taking it seriously to really include new music in their seasons. So like for example, the National Symphony Orchestra, each season they might have about 6 premieres, for example, by Mexican composers, young Mexican composers, and the Philharmonic also, and Ofunam also. So there's no shortage of opportunities to experience new music in Mexico. If you're interested, you can find them.
Yeah, that's even more reason to for me to visit.
Oh,
It
definitely,
sounds like.
definitely. No, whenever you visit, I can guarantee you'll find several interesting concerts to
Yeah,
go to.
that's
Hmm.
great. So something that you mentioned to me before our conversation that I'd love to discuss is that your music acts as a what you call a portrait of the city. Can you talk a little bit more about this and whether or not it's intentional or if it's just like this subconscious thread that kind of runs through what you do?
Well, I do think it's kind of an unconscious thing that has become more and more conscious in the later months, I would say. The thing is that the title of my pieces is the last thing I write. I mean, the piece
Okay.
has to be
Yeah.
finished, double bar line at the end, and then I look at it and they say, okay, what's this called? And at first that was a huge problem for me because music has always been very abstract for me. So I looked at my piece, and a lot of the times I had no idea, but I had some, like, for example, my drawings or just crazy ideas I had maybe come up with, because I'm also a hobby prone person.
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah.
get interested in stuff. I used to watch documentaries about space at some point. So a lot of my pieces are named after space objects. And then anything that has caught my fancy in that time span is the title of the piece. And I feel like that works because a lot of the times I feel like audiences probably can use the help of having like some concept to associate with a piece, maybe something visual, maybe some story, something like that, to have a connection with the piece. So I was writing a piece for wind band, which is something that I was not very used to do at all. That was 2 years ago. And it was a collaboration between the symphonic band of the Faculty of Music of the UNAM with the wind ensemble at Dartmouth College.
Okay. Yeah.
They did a collaboration, and they actually put together a huge wind band. It was like more than 100 people, and they put them in the Sala Netzahualcoyotl, which is one of our best concert halls, and they played some pieces that they had commissioned. So, and one of them was my piece. So, because there was an audience of foreigners, I really wanted to make a piece that was a little bit of a presentation of Mexico City from my own very subjective point of view, because obviously we know that different places can be prone to acquiring stereotypes. So I'm sure people that don't really know that much about Mexico, yeah, why should they? No one knows everything, but they have a very likely a more stereotypical vision based on what they might have caught by looking at movies or something like that. So I really wanted to create this piece and to say this is my personal subjective experience of what Mexico City is to me. And then I realized other pieces I had written were based and inspired by places or things. Like, I wrote a piece about a tree, which was the tree that grew in my parents' backyard where me and my brother used to play as little kids. So that tree was important because when I was writing the piece, something happened and the tree died and it fell down.
Yeah.
So I dedicated the piece to the tree, and that tree, even if it's just one tree in a backyard in the city, is a part of the city. And then I've revisiting that idea. I've come to realize that I've been a pedestrian in Mexico City all of my life, because Mexico City is very pedestrian friendly. Like, you can get anywhere by using public transportation, walking, cycling, and obviously a lot of the times people use cars because they're very practical in many ways, but you don't really have to own a car. That's not like a necessary thing if you have a particular lifestyle. Like me, for example, I'm a teacher, so I have to get to school and back. I don't really have to carry a lot of equipment or materials or anything, so I can be a pedestrian. And that's been my life ever since I started moving on my own in the city as a teenager. So I have really lived here by walking the city, feeling the movements, the sun, which is very particular in Mexico City, the quality of light that we have here, the smells, the noises, the trees, the birds, the people, all of that, those impressions are in me because it's part of my life, and it has been for all of my for 30 years. So I've come to realize that the city is part of me. So my music, in many ways, is a reflection of what I've become as a citizen of this city.
Well, I think like this conversation of how do you convey. I mean, maybe that's it. Like, how do you generally, like, how do we as composers convey like a sense of place, or like what you're describing, like people or light in our music? And so I mean, I guess that leads me to like, how do you do that? I mean, how, like, do you have examples of how Mexico City might appear in your harmony, or your the structures of your piece, or plug in rhythms, any musical element?
I think structure. There's a very clear example, which was the piece that was played at Penn State. That piece is called Súbita Sombra, and that name means a sudden shadow, which is this very specific moment when you're like out there on the street and suddenly there's a shadow on top of you and then it's gone, just like that. And the concept of the piece is to take that moment and expand it to 15 minutes, but like having like this expansion of time to be really able to savor all of the little emotions and all of the things that happen really in a split second when you're engulfed in a shadow, because that's kind of surprising. And that might be a slight emotion of fear, or just a sensation. Like, big emotions can happen in small amounts, I think. And that sudden shadow is something that happens here in my house every day, because we don't really live close to the airport, but we are right under the route airplanes take
Yeah.
when they go to the airport, because airplanes, like, I don't know why they do this, but they like approach the city and they have like a route they follow around the city, and they eventually go to the airport, like a queue of airplanes, I suppose. And we're right under that path. So if I'm like out on the street, like coming back, it's a common occurrence that suddenly an airplane will fly by, and that split second sensation of a shadow is right on top of you. You know, other things like rhythms and harmonies. I really think my my approach to rhythm has changed very dramatically over the last years. But it used to be my music was used to be very, very strongly rhythmical, like very full of energy. And I think that comes partly from my past as a percussionist, as a drummer, as a kid, but that is fueled by living in a city like this one, because there's movement, there's almost a little bit of daily chaos, if you know what I mean. Like, I've visited people in other places of the republic, and they've told me, oh, Mexico City is a little intimidating to me. uh yeah. And I don't find it intimidating, or maybe just in the right amount, because obviously there are dangerous areas, you should learn to avoid. But in general, we do get used to this little bit of chaos, like lots of cars, lots of people moving, people hurrying about. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of energy, a lot of activity. And really, I think that is very, very much present in most of my earlier music. Then I've changed a little bit of my style, and I've really gone into the more contemplative, very slow
Mm.
kind of thing.
Thinking about harmony, and I'm thinking about your piece that was performed at Penn State, which was just gorgeous. I mean, just in the way that, I mean, the way you describe it now. I mean, I don't remember if there were program notes. I didn't read any of the program notes for any of the pieces. Maybe I could have, but that was on me. But hearing you describe it, I mean, the piece makes even more sense, and just the way you kind of portray this through time is so gorgeous. But the harmony that you used, it was like almost like a crystal. I mean, it was like very crystalline, which I guess is the opposite of a shadow. Like it was very translucent. So I'll preface this by saying that before we started talking, you had shared with me that you have synesthesia, and that's your main tool when you work with things like harmony and orchestration, which is very tied to one another, I think. So I'm really curious about this. How when did you first realize this was something that you could work with in this way? And how do you consciously or subconsciously use this while composing?
Yeah, well, thank you for your for saying that you like my piece. I'm very happy.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually quite satisfied with that piece. I was a little bit insecure about it at first, but then when we were there, I was like, "Oh, it does work. It does work." So, yeah, I'm very happy you liked it. And yeah, I mean, synesthesia has been with me all my life to different degrees. When I was a kid, I remember having very visual experiences inside of my imagination relating to music, but it was more like in a fantasy way, you know? I suppose I was always a daydreamer when I was a kid. So music really was something that fueled my fantasy a lot. And it wasn't really until I started, I mean, I don't really remember that clearly, but when I started like playing around with my dad's keyboard, that I would spend hours and hours just playing with that keyboard and making music. I didn't have any sense of musical notation, and the sequencer didn't really have any visual aid because it was very basic. So the only way you could really know what you were making was by listening to it. So by accident, I suppose, my mind started creating these very abstract representations of the sounds in my mind. And I mean, I suppose it was just like this very natural thing to do. Like if you're writing words or a poem for some reason, and then you have to use whatever tool you have to read them out back to you, to make sense of them. And also, when I listen to music, you don't always know what kind of instrument is playing.
Right. Right.
Sometimes it's just a weird sound, and my mind created the representation in an abstract way. And that's related to this notion of the abstract expressionism, which is a genre of painting that I've always been attracted to, partly because I believe it's kind of like a language I understand. By the way, I didn't really know it was kind of like a big deal or anything important until I saw an actual documentary about synesthesia on TV one time. So at that point, I didn't even know it had a name or anything. I mean, it was just the way I did it. So it's been with me ever since, and it's been my main tool to working with harmony and timbre and orchestration. Just like I suppose a painter uses his eyes to look at his painting. So it's really been there. It also helps me think about structure, like musical form, because I can more or less have a basic idea of what I want my piece to look like. So I like take a seat back and I try to imagine what the whole landscape kind of looks like. And I have these really clear ideas like dark harmonies, low notes, that sort of thing is pretty dark. High pitched notes obviously are very luminous. Different instruments for me, they have different colors. Like for example, for me the clarinet sounds blue for some reason. That's so weird, right?
I can see that.
I can see that too. For stringed instruments sound green for me for some reason, and obviously depending on the range it's more bright green or dark green. But at the same time, also chords or different harmonies have different sensation of color. Like I find like some scales or chords might have more bright colors like orange and white, and other times like it can be like very brown and dark, you know. And I suppose that's just my way of thinking, and it helps because my music is very harmony and timbre focused more than, let's say, motif related, you know.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, you're giving such perfect examples of what synesthesia is, but I realized while you were talking, like I should have probably explained what it is before I asked you the question because it feels like such a given in our world. Like, okay, we all know what this is, but
Yes, of course.
for folks who are listening who are like, what, what is
What's
synesthesia?
happening?
It's basically like when like two of your senses kind of become linked with one another. So in your case, it's like sound and visual kind of get tied together. Maybe another example could be I've never heard of this happening, but like when you eat food, you hear something, right? Like
Yeah, I've never
that could
heard of that, but I can see that happening. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. The kind of sound that texture has, you know?
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
So, I mean, what you're describing makes me think of kind of like pre-compositional tools almost. Like anytime I sit down to write a piece of music, I start visually, like with a graphic representation of what I want to make. I'm not like to the degree that you're talking about. Like I don't see colors or anything or whatever. But is that part of your process? I mean, is or does it kind of like you sit down and at a piano maybe and play through stuff and you receive this like synesthetic information that you write down and like it kind of it's like a feedback loop of some kind.
Mm. Yeah, well, process is a very interesting concept because I don't know. I don't really know. I suppose by now I should know what my process is, but I don't really know that well because it changes all the time, you know? Yeah, that's part of the problem, you know. I really wish I could write easily, but a lot of the time I'm like, how do I write this piece? So I guess we can all be quite visual to a different degree. And you know, structure, as you said, that's a one of the most important, I think, elements in music. I think great harmonies, great melodies, great textures, great orchestration, great everything. If the form doesn't work, the piece doesn't work. And
Yeah,
if it has good elements, it's kind of a shame. So I do think form is what really makes or breaks a piece, in my opinion. It's funny because a lot of the times when I'm teaching, I have my students make graphs of the piece they're going to write. Like, I think that's a good tool. It sets us in the position where we have to think structurally, you know. And I think that's very important. I also think that in my case, I really want to keep the form flexible because it's one thing to have an initial idea of what you want the form to be, but that doesn't necessarily fit with how the music is actually going to behave
right.
once you're starting writing. So in my case, I have a structural idea in my mind. I don't do a map or anything on paper. I just have the idea, have a like a basic, let's say, a sketch of a basic form, and then I start writing the music. And then when I start writing the music, I realize, oh, this is happening. Oh, the music wants to go here. Maybe this makes more sense. So I can adjust my vision of the entirety of the piece as I am writing it. And you know that comes from a visual representation in my
Right.
mind. Hmm.
I feel like when I every time I get to this next question, it's already been answered in some way, but I'll ask you more directly and we can see how it spins out from there. But what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? And this could be, kind of like philosophical touchstones. It could be stylistic elements. It could be anything that kind of makes whatever you feel makes your music you.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a big question because I think those parameters have changed through time, but something that's always been there is emotion and color. Rhythm. It's so weird what has happened to rhythm in my music. Like, because up until 2019, more or less, I was still writing this very rhythmical music, and it's not just music like with a pulse and like a rhythmic feel to it, but it was emphatically rhythmic. Like rhythm was one of the most important aspects of my music, and suddenly I like turned 180 degrees and avoided all notion of pulse, or almost so, and really started doing this. I once heard it called written rubato. Have you
Uh,
heard that term?
yes.
Yeah, so you do tuplets and ties and things like that in order to dilute the sensation of pulse without requiring something more complex like proportional notation or things like that. So within conventional notation, you can find ways to approach this different rhythmic sensation.
Yeah, I love this idea because it's something that I've been doing in my music for a while now, and I'm trying to push past conventional notation at this point with my most recent piece that I'm working on. But I've always loved obscuring any sensation of pulse, like you're talking about, and it's even to a point where in every piece or anytime I work with a performer or a group of an ensemble of any kind, I let them know, like, okay, yes, here's a quintuplet, here's a septuplet, here's like all these like rhythmic things, but don't overthink it, right? It's not like Brian Fernyhough level of complexity where it's like the point is the difficulty. It's my point is, make it sound like you're improvising. And don't,
Exactly, I agree.
and so I totally know where you're coming from.
Yes, no, exactly. That's the idea. That's exactly the idea, to make it sound free. You know, it looks difficult on the page, but really it's just music that is trying to avoid the sensation of pulse and to break free from that feeling. And it's so funny because it's music that is in also, it's a style of writing that is trying to do something that conventional notation wasn't designed for, really. Proportional notation is truer in that sense because you don't have to write a septuplet and all these weird ties and 16th notes at the end of a of a long note, for example, or at the beginning. I do think it has very practical advantages. Like, for example, if people can count basic rhythms, that they
Mm.
can play the music, and it works for ensembles. I think that's a basic advantage because if you write, for example, a piano piece or a piece for solo anything, then there's no problem because they don't have to have simultaneity of events with other instruments. And there are pieces that, like chamber pieces, that use proportional notation, and people manage, composers and performance manage to pull through, and that's, I admire that. I think it's really cool. My personal experience has led me to not really require that much degree of notation at the moment, but things always change. So we were talking about rhythm, but also about the pillars in music. So I was saying also, emotion is probably essential to me, I think, in music.
And you've brought up emotion so many times. I was going to ask you about this to a point
Yeah,
where the very first thing you said in our conversation was, this emotional impression you had from this play
yeah,
as a child. So
exactly.
I'd love to talk more about this.
I mean, to me, and I suppose to most people out there, we almost don't really have to say that there's a connection between music and emotion because it's like so obvious that that's there, But I do think it's important to emphasize it because I think And I take this from some of the things I learned when I was studying composition at school. There are so many other aspects of music, you know, technical aspects that are very seductive, things like very sophisticated in terms of the mathematics of a piece, for
Right.
example,
Right.
and that sort of thing, where emotion can even be pushed aside a little bit. And I think emotion should be have a center place in music composition, basically for its own good, because emotion is what creates a connection between the listener and the piece. And I learned this when, well, I didn't learn it, but I really ratified it, and and it became really clear to me. One time I was listening, well, I was teaching a class about the history of music, and I asked my students to bring pieces that they liked from a specific period, and a student came with piano sonata by Beethoven, the Pathétique. And I had heard it before, but I am this kind of a weird person where sometimes mainstream pieces slip by my fingers. So I didn't really know it that well, but it started playing, and I heard the first chords, and it struck me emotionally so strongly, just with like three chords, you know? And I realized Beethoven knew the power and importance of emotion. And people who listen to Beethoven today, they feel that emotion. And the reason they do is because the music produces that emotion. So, part of the reason why I think the music of Beethoven will live for many, many more years is because of its powerful emotional connection it develops with people. So from that moment, I realized, like, yes, emotion. that I I I said to myself, I have to learn how to do that.
Yeah. Right.
How to like create music that touches the emotions, the heart of someone. You know, and I think because it's important, because it's good for the music, and because it makes the world a better place in general.
Yeah, it seems like such a subjective thing, though. I totally agree with you. I'll say that, but it seems so subjective. It's one of those things like how do you teach that? How do you learn that? It's the same with how do you teach people to be curious? How do you learn to be curious? That kind of a thing. I mean, so do you find that if you have an emotional response to the music, do you feel like that's kind of the answer, or is it like specific harmonies convey emotion? I mean, Beethoven, your Beethoven example is so universal. It's like it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what the notes are. It's like it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so I agree. Like I think that's one of the main problems in music. Like because we have to realize that to a degree music is a collection of symbols, right? Symbols in the form of sound that convey specific messages to a degree. I don't really know. I mean, I think these are open questions. But the point is that I know, because we've seen it, that different people react differently to the same piece, right? Some people listen to Beethoven and say, oh, that's boring, you know? And other people might say, are you kidding? It's brilliant. So that's the world we live in, where people are very different from each other. I mean, wouldn't it be cool to say, oh, this chord produces this emotion? Like, we can't do that. So there's a lot of in between points in the translation or whatever happens in people's brains, and which are all different, that we will never have a straight correlation.
Right.
What I like to do is to say, okay, let's just assume that we're all different, but we're all similar, right? So we're not like completely different. We share a lot of things with our fellow human beings. So let's work from the assumption that what works to me might work for a significant group of people. Like, and really, that's the only choice you can make, because when you're writing your music, you're the judge. You have to figure out if it works for you. Like, you really don't really have that much of a choice, because you wouldn't change a piece just because someone else didn't like it, if it even if you liked it, right? Yeah, so I start from there and say, okay, let's assume different people are different, but some of them might share something similar to my musical perception and will understand what I'm trying to do, at least in part, and assume that, and then just write music that works for me. But how do you teach that? I think it's, to a degree, it's impossible to teach it specifically. All one can say is realize that music conveys emotion in a weird way that none of us can really understand fully, but it does happen. So be aware of the power of emotion in music. And I think it's noble to try to touch people's emotions with music.
Yeah, for sure. I love that we've gotten into this kind of like the intangible kind of esoteric
Yeah.
nature of music, and something else that you said to me before our conversation is that you intentionally make musical ideas non-memorable, so that when the music ends, the audience is left with a sensation rather than a theme. I feel like emotion and sensation, I mean, these are things that kind of make like the soul of what we do. I mean, and then the outside layer of that is, rhythm, harmony, color, all the elements. So I mean, this idea of sensation and non-memory, I guess, is really fascinating to me for a few reasons, because this was also my experience with the work that I heard of yours at Penn State. I what I remember is not specifically what it sounded like. It's like how it made me feel and the general atmosphere of it, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't tell
Mhm.
you anything about like the notes or the rhythms.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, that's intentional. That's kind of the idea. That's
Yeah.
the idea. And I arrived to this idea, I guess, in stages. At first, when I started writing my music, I was like very, let's say, very convinced with many of the classical concepts. Like,
Mm,
for example, a piece must have a recapitulation. I mean, it doesn't have to, but it kind of makes sense to have a recapitulation, to have a set of ideas at the beginning, then some sort of development, and then repeat the beginning, because that rounds the piece off very nicely. And it tells a neat story. you know Composers over the ages have used this technique. And I feel one of the first steps I started to take away from that is that I decided not to recapitulate anything at the end. Just make my music a sequence of different ideas, and then at some point end, and try to make it into a convincing narrative nonetheless. You know. And by the way, you probably don't remember the piece I did for Borderlands Ensemble, which was for strings and horn. But that was one of the first pieces I experimented with this idea, to have just a sequence of ideas, and that's all. Try to tell a compelling story without really repeating anything. And I felt that was pretty cool. I felt like it worked. And then thinking about it a little further, I started to think about what I, I guess I started to remember what some of my first experiences were when I went to classical music concerts, and before I had any sort of formal training in music. And I remember, like, if you listen to a Beethoven symphony, for example, that's one thing. But let's say they play a Bruckner symphony. Like that's a whole different level. And if you don't know the piece, it's very, very hard to get a grip on what's going on. It's very difficult because you have to have an initiation into what to expect from a specific musical form, and you have to have good memory for the themes. And I realized this idea of memory in music doesn't really work for everyone, because not everyone has great memory in music. Then by teaching, I've also realized that not even musicians have that good a memory, you
Yeah.
know?
Yep.
And then I say, well, is it necessary to do this? I mean, can we just make music that doesn't really require that extra effort of like spending the first minutes of a piece really focusing on remembering the themes so that later on you can know what's going on? So I felt like, well, what if music didn't require memory? And I came to an interesting conclusion, which is that music that requires memory or that incites memory, because if a piece is really going on and on with a specific theme, it's in a way it's asking you to really recall this idea, you know? And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, obviously, but it's memory based music, right? So in memory based music, what's actually happening, I think, is that it puts you in a situation where at any point in time when you're listening to the piece, you have to remember the past and attempt to predict the future in order to make sense of the present, right? You're in a state where you have to be thinking about the past and the future to understand the present. So you're in those three spaces all the time. So if the music doesn't allow you to memorize anything, then it's really difficult to try to predict anything. So all you're left with is being in the present. And if the present is lush and beautiful and full of emotion, I think the present is a good place to be.
Yeah, it's like rather than crafting like a narrative of some kind, it's like it's an environment that you just
An
kind of sit in.
environment.
You sit in for a while, and
You sit in for a while. And that doesn't mean you can't tell a story, because you can
right.
have dramatic curve and you can have a climax at some point. I mean, you can still have a notion of form and of narrative, but it's not something that is really dependent on, do you remember the three note motif at the first movement? Because now we're in the fourth movement and here it goes inverted, you know?
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, I think it was about 4 years ago I started thinking about this concept of like memory in music, and I was working on a string quartet, and I called up a longtime mentor of mine for a lesson actually, which I don't do too often. I don't hit up composers for lessons now that I'm like trying to make a living doing it, you know. But it felt like a really important piece, and we went through it, and he got stuck on this like moment in the cello where there's just this like it's like a high note that's pizzicatoed, and it kind of and he was like this. He's like, you need to put this in other places to remind people where they've been, like as little musical waypoints. And I was like, oh my god, he's right. And I've had the piece recorded. I just had it was just premiered in Japan a few months ago. In that moment, like with the cello, every time that pizzicato comes back, I'm like so deeply satisfied. And I think like to your point, it's kind of asking people to remember that, but at the same time, it's almost like a verification. Like, okay, like yes, all of this is changing in the moment. Like the piece is just undergoing constant transformation, and it never really comes back to much. But then these little, just like brief, I mean, one note moments happen. That's like, okay, we're heading in the right direction. It's like little like signs while you're hiking or something. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing is that there's a difference between music not being like thematically memorable and not being internally consistent, right? I do think music has to be very natural and flow like a river. So obviously, things that happen at some point have previous ideas that have consequences throughout the narrative. The thing is, the more and more I spend time writing music, the more I realize I don't really know what I'm doing, you know? Like I'm
Yeah,
what I start to realize like why am I writing this? And that's okay. It doesn't bother me. I think it's good to be very intuitive because then I think back and I go over my ideas and I say, well, I think this, but then I wrote this piece and there's clearly a motif. So what are you doing? So I don't know. I guess being a composer is to be in a constant state of experimentation, and maybe you'll never get to a final result. Like maybe that's not the point, just to continue to experiment and in the process leave a bunch of pieces written.
for sure. I totally
Mhm.
agree. I know how easy it is to hear a mid roll just like this one and tune out completely. I do it too. Actually, I even skip through them sometimes. But if you've been enjoying this episode and you're still with me here, this is a great moment to hit follow, leave a quick rating, or just tell a friend. All of those actions really do matter, and you can find links in the show notes, or you can visit looseleaftransmissions.com to do all of those things and more. So I'm curious about like inspirations you've had in your creative life. So what is it could be a piece of music. What's a piece of music or even just a song, a film, a book, a piece of art? You've talked about abstract expressionism, for example. Any of those kinds of things that changed the way that you thought about your work or even changed your life?
Yeah, let's see. I suppose there have been specific pieces that I've heard that have made me realize the importance of certain things. Like, for example, we were discussing Beethoven a few moments ago. Beethoven has been a big composer in my life. I mean, I always liked the symphonies, I remember being quite young, a teenager, listening to the Ninth Symphony, obviously, the Seventh Symphony. I'll tell you one memory I have, very powerful. The first time I heard Beethoven's Seventh Symphony was live, actually. I'd never heard it. And my dad took us, me and my brother. We went there and we heard it. And obviously, after the second movement, we just like looked at each other and I was like, what just happened?
Yeah.
That was probably the most amazing thing that's ever happened in my life. And you know, I to this day I do consider that to be one of the greatest pieces Beethoven wrote in general, So powerful. I mean, that's an impression I have. I also remember very vividly. I also heard Penderecki's the Hiroshima piece, the Threnody. I heard it live for the first time, and that was very amazing because I didn't expect anything. Obviously, like no one, if you don't know that author, you don't expect anything. But the least thing you can expect from, let's say, maybe a more conservative point of view is to have a piece that is so abstract and yet so compelling, you know and when I heard that piece, I was immediately in love. I went to bought the CD. Another piece was Fantasy on a Theme by Thomas Tallis.
Oh, that one's yeah, the Von
That one's
Williams.
amazing.
Oh my
Oh
god.
yeah, Vaughan Williams. Amazing piece. Like I remember sitting there, first three chords or something, three notes or whatever, and I was like, oh my god, this is so beautiful. I hope this is the entirety of the piece. And it's not exactly, but the vibe is kind of throughout the piece is like so amazing and wonderful. Yes, I mean, I suppose the pieces that have really stayed with me the most are the ones that have really given me really strong and profound experiences while listening to them. And now that I remember, those have been live experiences. Like I suppose there are exceptions, but that really gives me a renewed like intention to go as many live concerts as I can, because sometimes life gets in the way, right? But to go to the concerts, very very important. But to answer your question, I mean, I'm not sure if a particular piece has sent me like in a different direction. Not really sure, but my life is like full of very strong experiences with pieces of music. Yeah, mostly pieces of music. I'll tell you another one. I'm a heavy metal fan,
Yeah.
and I heard a band called Meshuga or
Oh,
Meshuga.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one amazing band. It's still my favorite band, and I remember hearing it for the first time at a friend's house, and I was so amazed with what they do with with rhythm, basically, with like what's happening with the metric all the time. Before that, my brother used to be very much into like Balkanic gypsy music, which is prone to have odd time signatures, but regular, right? So when you realize there is no way ever that you're going to be able to to know how this piece is written, because it's always changing, and it's a kind of comfortable helplessness, you know okay, it's incredibly complex. I it's incredibly complex, it's always changing, and I love the sensation, you know and that was a big influence in my earlier music. I have to say, I will return one day to the rhythmic stuff. I just don't know when, but it will happen. Yeah, so my inspiration comes from almost all of the music I hear. I like when people say, "Hey, have you listened to this? Try this new piece or whatever." But yes, I do remember the first time I heard Beethoven's Seventh live. That was amazing. When I heard Penderecki live, that was amazing. Thomas Tallis, Fantasia, amazing also. Very strong experiences. And I don't suppose this is. It's not necessarily. Well, this is another work. I mean, when I first heard Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, I don't really remember that much the first time I heard it played on a CD, but then I was teaching orchestration, and I felt it had some useful examples, so I brought it in and I listened to it many times during a semester with my students, and by the end I was hooked. You know, it's such a powerful piece. It brought tears to my eyes almost every time, and yeah, those are strong experiences with music. I guess you just have to keep listening and letting yourself be amazed.
I think that's it. Yeah. Just stay open, stay curious,
Stay curious.
and see where things take you. Well, first of all, I have to say that it's amazing that you drew a line from like Beethoven to Meshuggah.
Why does
But
that happen?
I totally get it, because I love all kinds of music too, and I'm influenced by all kinds of different musics. But it's a great segue because I'd love to talk about your chamber rock ensemble, which you touched on earlier, and you kind of explained what prompted you to form this group, which was called Orcus. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
So, I mean, how did this function? I mean, with you as a composer, but also you performed with it, and like, what were the other instruments in the group? How was it received by audiences? And it ended in 2019, but has it had any kind of lasting impact on your work to this day?
Oh yeah, well, very much. I mean, I think the lasting impact has been. primarily in really knowing what happens to music from the perspective of someone reading it off a page, you know? Because, well, I'll tell you how it functioned. Basically, I would write pieces of music, and I knew from almost the get go that we like to improvise. So I would include some solo sections, like for a riff to loop and then to have like a clarinet solo, for example. By the way, the instruments changed a little, but I was playing percussion. We had a double bass, a cello, a viola, which later changed to violin, a clarinet, which also doubled on bass clarinet, and an oboe, an English horn,
Wow.
which eventually became a bassoon. And so what I would do is what I would write the music on my computer, print out the parts, take them to the rehearsal, and say, guys, well, this is a new piece. Let's give it a go. And obviously, we would stumble a little at the beginning. We would have to work on the hard parts. I learned a lot, really, really, really a lot about what really is important when you write stuff. Like, there's a bunch of stuff. Um, I guess I reduced the complexity of my music at that point, not because I wanted it to be simpler, but because I felt like there was some unnecessary complexity that could be shaved off without like any negative impact. So I learned how an ensemble tackles music. I saw what kind of stuff made us like was hard for us to put together in the music, and I learned basically what kind of works with the instrument. So I learned a lot about instrumentation, dynamics, articulation, ranges, registers, that sort of thing. That's a part of what I learned. I also learned a lot about human interactions and how to have a project. It's really exhausting, really, to have a band, to have a project. It's a full time job almost. To have get gigs, for example, to get there, to to negotiate payment, to record an album, good experiences, bad experiences with studios, that sort of thing. But the audiences, they really liked it because I guess because it was very like in this very rhythmical thing. It wasn't like music you really had to focus a lot on. It was like music with a lot of energy. And we were also very well rehearsed because we would practice. We would get together to practice every Monday in the evening. So whenever we had a gig, the music we had it there. And we did have like changing time signatures, like the sort of stuff that makes progressive rock fans wild,
Mm, yep.
because they like this band or that other band, and it kind of worked with that sort of audience. But we played in smaller places like jazz clubs, restaurants. We had a few gigs in bigger places. We did a bunch of projects. Like we also did we improvised a musical accompaniment to Eraserhead, the movie by
Yeah.
David Lynch.
Yep.
So that was one of the things we used to do once or twice. We did like we would play alongside the movie, and we like created some of the atmospheres or whatever. So it was well received. People would consistently say that they liked our music, that they liked the energy of the band. But you know, bands are complicated and they take a lot of time and energy. So the project eventually ended, but fortunately, we do have a CD. So it's out there on Spotify. People can listen to it, and you know, it really has a full taste of the material that we managed to generate in those years.
Were you the only composer involved, or did you like commission other composers or play anyone else's music ever?
That's funny because I was the main composer, but the viola player had a piece, the clarinet player had a really, really cool piece. We did play music that wasn't written by me, but it was always a music that was written by members of the ensemble.
I see. Yeah,
So we wrote for each other, you know?
that's great. That's
That
awesome.
was really cool.
I mean, it sounds like I don't know, maybe it ended and now you don't have time, or for whatever reason, like your music's moved in a different direction, or but do you feel like this is something that you would ever kind of resurrect, or like start something new that would be like kind of along the same lines?
Eventually, I think so because I do like to play, but at the moment, I'm like very happy where I am. Like I'm basically I'm doing a lot of teaching, and I'm writing my orchestral music, and that's really taking up all of my time. So yeah, so whenever I have a little bit more time and I feel like I need to start playing in public again, then I'll definitely think about like getting the people back together. Uh,
Yeah.
I also have learned experiences about like how better to coordinate an ensemble. So there have been lessons learned regarding that as well. So it would be a different project, I would say. But yeah, definitely. Playing is awesome. Playing in public is really cool.
Yeah, I don't do that. I don't ever do that. So, um, so before I get to my final questions, I'd love to bring this kind of full circle back to something that we've touched on a lot. You just now touched on it, but really haven't digging into too much, and that's your interest in writing for large ensembles and orchestras specifically. I know you have several projects lined up right now of concerti and maybe just an orchestra by itself. And clearly, you said you had 20 orchestra pieces, which is incredible on its own. So, what is it that draws you to composing for larger ensembles like an orchestra?
Basically, I would say it's just that the orchestra has so much, like, such a huge range of timbres and sound possibilities. It has like so much power. I mean, it feels like when I was that little kid playing with my dad's sequencer. I think that what I was really trying to do was what the orchestra can do, which is give you an almost unlimited array of sounds and possibilities of expression. That's one thing. The other is, I mean, as I've mentioned, this big part of my life that started in my late teens about going to orchestra concerts. So when I visualize myself as a composer, I suppose I was always thinking of writing for orchestra because it was the classical music that I was exposed to the most. And the thing is, with orchestral music, that it's kind of difficult, right? As a composer to have an orchestra play your piece, your music. So yeah, it took me like from that early experience that I mentioned to where I am today. It has taken a lot of time of like networking and creating a name for myself, and you know participating in competitions and losing most of them but winning some.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know just being relentless, and it has taken some time but it's been paying off lately. And in Mexico at the moment, I have some conductors that are clearly, they really like my music, that want to continue playing it and programming it. So I think that's where you want to be at, like to have allies in the orchestra world that think that your music is important, that it should be played. And I've been fortunate enough to have found some people that have been there for me and helped and given me those opportunities.
it, I feel like as a composer myself, but also like as you pointed out, like getting an orchestra to play your piece is like that's like a dream.
It's a dream.
and,
It's a
and
dream.
and so like with that in mind, I mean, you've checked that box. Like what's the next level of that? I mean, do you have a dream piece that you haven't gotten to write yet for a full orchestra?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of my orchestral pieces are in the 10 to 15-minute range
Yeah.
in duration. And I really want to make a large scale piece, like a multi movement piece. But I have an issue with movements because there's a big problem with movements. Because you know how when you're in a conversation with someone and suddenly you don't know what to say and the other person doesn't know what to say, and there's like this awkward silence. The king of awkward silences, the absolute awkwardest of all awkward silences, is between the movements of a piece,
Yeah.
you know? Because someone maybe wants to clap but doesn't know if he should. Someone hushes them and a bunch of people cough. Like, that's so weird. I don't understand that. That's such a weird feeling, you know?
Yeah.
So if I do a multi-movement piece, I'll have to figure out a way of connecting the movements. I think that's probably what I would do, to do it the attacca approach to movements. But I don't know. I mean, at the moment, I would like to have a big project like that, and I'm working towards it in a way.
I guess, and we all are working towards that whatever that is for each of us in a
Yeah.
way with every piece, right? So, getting into my final set of questions, and these are questions I ask everybody, so it's always fun to see like the different answers people have. But I guess like you talked about that you teach and whatnot. So you know, kind of disregarding that and disregarding your artistic life, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't composing? Like if you were doing some other job totally unrelated.
Yeah, well, I have a strong connection to the graphic arts. So I love to draw. I've always loved to draw since I was a kid. I also like I would like to be an artist, you know, like a painter or someone who draws watercolors, sculpture, that sort of thing. That's very attractive to me. So if I weren't a musician, maybe I'd be an artist. Also, I have a bunch of interests in other stuff like science, but I'm not really sure that I have a mind that's organized enough to be able to do things like data collection,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I have a different type of brain, but I do find things like nature and the universe and human evolution and archaeology and that sort of stuff. I find those things very, very, very fascinating. Hmm.
What are you trying to get better at in your creative life right now?
I think I'm trying not to get worse at finding inspiration, because
Mm.
at first I used to be like a very confident writer, you know, a composer. Like I would have, okay, this is the idea, start writing. Like I would see my fellow students when I was a student, like really struggle with coming up with musical ideas, and that was never my problem. Recently I've had a bit of a a bit of difficulty finding ideas, or finding the right ideas for my music. And I feel like that's just, I need to learn how to calibrate better my self censorship, or my filter, right? Because if you set the bar too low, then not so good music comes out. But if you set the bar too high, no music comes out, you know? So you have to be able to say, okay, I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be to write the next brilliant piece. I just have to write a good piece, something that I like and enjoy, and I feel like makes sense. And to be able to calibrate your level, you know, where you're actually, you know, producing good music, but you are producing music, you know. So that's what I'm trying to get better at, to be able to calibrate my output so I can optimize the quality and the quantity of my composition.
Yeah, I hear you. And I mean, it sounds a little bit also like grappling with like perfectionism, which is, that's a constant battle, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
the best piece of advice I got from someone once was like, it doesn't have to be good. It just has to be finished.
I
and,
like that idea.
and,
I like it.
and,
I
coming,
like it.
coming to terms with the fact that, not every piece is going to be like this world changing, incredible piece of art. Like sometimes a piece of music is just, it's just something for fun
It's
or,
just another piece of music.
yeah.
Exactly. And also, I've learned to let go of this like linear thing that we can assume sometimes, not necessarily by choice, but we just assume that each piece has to be better than the last one.
Right.
But that's a difficult place to be in if your last piece was really good. Like what you do next, like that can be a bit frightening, But if maybe your next piece just has to be your next piece, and that's all.
Yeah. I love it. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? This could be like an actual object, like a tool. It could be a process or it could be a software, anything like that.
Actually, my tools, I don't really have many tools. I mean, I have my piano back there, and I use standard notation on Sibelius, and those are basically my tools. So as physical objects, but I do think a good tool is like other people. Like sometimes it doesn't have to be anyone, but like for example, when I finish a piece, I always show the MIDI rendering to my girlfriend and members of my family, and just see how they react and see if I can figure out if there's like a place in the piece where maybe something lasts too long or it's too short or whatever. Like finding a way to have some input from people that it's not necessarily like, hey, could you write an essay on my piece? Like
Right. Right.
something like more relaxed, and just see what they think or how they react. I think that's a good tool.
Yeah, for
Mhm.
sure. Especially if it's someone who isn't in the same world as we're in. Like
Exactly.
if I show a friend of mine who's like not a composer or even a musician, like, hey, what do you think of this? And it's like, okay, this is what like a regular a regular person thinks about
Exactly.
what I'm
That's so
doing.
important because uh, professional musicians have a set of ideas. They would probably discuss the form, or I don't know, a bunch of stuff. But like a layman will say, will just give you their like honest impressions, and I think that's probably the most valuable feedback you can get. Yeah.
Yeah. Perspective too.
Perspective.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Absolutely. So Charlie, this has been wonderful, and I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and so maybe you don't have an answer to this to my last question, my final question, but we'll see what you think. But my final question is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
That's a good question. I suppose that as an artist, especially a composer, especially when I write like for orchestra or something, so, things like that, people might think that this is high art, high art. Like this is music for the initiated or for people who have sophisticated taste and things like that. And I just want to say, my music really is intended for everyone. For everyone, I like to say this is kind of corny, but sometimes I like to say, if you have 2 ears and a heart, then you can listen to this piece and it's for you.
Oh, yeah. I love that. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for your time. It's been great getting to know you better. Again, like when I first met you, like I feel like we talked for like 10 minutes and then it's like in a bar. It was crazy. And so
Yeah, it was crazy.
this has been great. And definitely let you know when we decide to come to Mexico City, and we'll hang out.
Awesome. We'll be waiting. Thanks so much for inviting me to the podcast, Tyler. I had a lot of fun.
So much fun indeed. Just a great time hanging out with Charly there for a couple hours. I can't wait, Charly, to sit down with a little bit of mezcal and do it again sometime, hopefully sooner rather than later. I just loved everything Charly had to say about life in Mexico and how that shapes his art that he makes. And if you have not heard his music, I highly encourage you to check it out. You can find more about Charly and his music on his website. That's charlesphilipdanielstorres.com, and I will be sure to include a link to that in the show notes. I'm Tyler Kline. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me here on Music Maker. The show is produced by Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears, and you can explore more episodes and support the work that I'm doing here at looseleaftransmissions.com. Thanks again for listening. Can't wait to share the next conversation with you. Bye for now.